Our scripture lesson this morning comes from the Gospel according to Matthew, chapter 2, verses 1 through 12. In the time of King Herod, after Jesus was born in Bethlehem of Judea, wise men from the east came to Jerusalem asking, "Where is the child who has been born King of the Jews? For we observed his star at its rising and have come to pay him homage." When King Herod heard this, he was frightened, and all Jerusalem with him. And calling together all the chief priests and the scribes of the people, he inquired of them where the Messiah was to be born. They told him, "In Bethlehem of Judea, for it was written by the prophet, 'And you, Bethlehem, in the land of Judah, are by no means least among the rulers of Judah, for from you shall come a ruler who is to shepherd my people Israel.'" Then Herod secretly called for the wise men and learned from them the exact time when the star had appeared. Then he sent them to Bethlehem, saying, "Go and search diligently for the child. And when you have found him, bring me word so I may go and pay him homage as well." When they heard the king, they set out, and there ahead of them went the star that they had seen at its rising, until it stopped over the place where the child was. When they saw that the star had stopped, they were overwhelmed with joy. On entering the house, they saw the child with Mary, his mother, and they knelt down and paid him homage. Then opening their treasure chests, they offered him gifts of gold, frankincense, and myrrh. And having been warned in a dream not to return to Herod, they left for their own country by another road. Friends, this is the word of God for us, the people of God. Thanks be to God. Amen.
I was probably about 6 or 7 years old, and I was going home from church with my father. It was Christmas time, and I was pretty excited because we were going by the Catholic church, and I really enjoyed going by there at Christmas time because they had these kind of life-size ceramic figures in the nativity scene. So we were going by, and I all of a sudden called out, "Where did they go?" And my dad said, "What do you mean, where did they go?" I said, "Somebody has come and stolen the wise men." And he said, "Son, this is a Catholic church, and they observe Epiphany." I said, "What?" That just became a teachable moment. He said, "Epiphany." Jeff, I think my mic is going in and out. So I said, "What, Epiphany?" And he said, "Yes, Epiphany." And he said, for the Catholics, now they just say they like to think the wise men will come a little bit after Christmas, the next season, Epiphany. Well, we've come a ways as Methodists. Have you looked at the heading of your bulletin? Here we are. We're thoroughly acknowledging we're a part of the Christian year, and this is called Epiphany Sunday. And this is the Sunday more than any other that we accentuate the hope of our faith, the light that keeps coming into the darkness. And who was it that followed the light of the star? It was the wise men. So we shouldn't be surprised that they often show up on Epiphany Sunday. Now, who were these people? In the original, it says Magi, and in my footnote in the RSV, it says something like, well, these were learned people from Eastern Persia. Raymond Brown, New Testament scholar, says they really represented kind of a conglomeration of astronomers and augurers and fortune tellers and magicians of varying degrees of plausibility. But then Raymond Brown went on and said, I imagine that when Matthew wrote this down, he was really referring to stargazers, to astronomers. Surprise, 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 in the words of Gomer Pyle. Now, can you imagine the first readers of the Gospel of Matthew think they're going to open a very traditional religious document steeped in Jewish tradition and hear these outsiders beginning the Gospel? But you know, it really makes sense that these are the ones that are ushering in a season of hope. I mean, just think about it. Stargazers, they were masters of that art of opening their mind to a world beyond their own. And isn't that the essence of true hope, reaching with our minds and our faith beyond what we can touch and see and control? I love the true story about the old trail guide that had this habit of taking young people out, and he loved to give them the wilderness away from all the light pollution. And then as the stars began to come out in the evening, he would get them there to stretch out on the meadow and to look up, and he would say, "Look up there now and tell me, how far can you think?" And they would go, "What do you mean, how far can we think?" He said, no, just screw on your imagination, look back up there and tell me, how far can you think? And well, they would try their best, and one of them would come back and say, "I think I can think as far as there's Taurus and there's the Big Dipper." And the guide said, "Okay, put a stake right there. Now do it again." "What do you mean, do it again?" "What's on the other side of your stake?" "Oh, more sky, lots more sky, and stars tumbling upon more stars." And he would say, "Move your stake." And they would spend the rest of the evening moving the stake. Isn't that crazy? But isn't that good? You see, stargazers, they have this capacity to look into the darkness and see that fine, bright light that pushes us into something larger, maybe all the way to God. Now, these magi, they weren't just gazers, they were seekers, you see. Why did they have to travel so far? Why couldn't they have just been satisfied looking into the sky and thinking they kind of held on to some secret? But no, there was another voice, a deeper voice that said, "Go, you go and see for yourselves." And that's what's happening here. They've been gazing and now they're seeking. And their seeking takes them to Jerusalem. That would make sense. I mean, they thought this had something to do with some kind of king in Jerusalem. Well, there is a palace. It's the seat of Herod. I love the way Barbara Brown Taylor describes their quest. She says, "Oh, they got easy access into the palace of Herod." Well, you know, they looked like they were rich, and that's all it took to have an audience with Herod, except they were quickly disappointed. So here they were, they're in Herod's palace, and they didn't even have to confer with one another. They just got a feeling of the place, and they said, "This is not the one we're looking for." But they turned to Herod and they said, "Oh, by the way, has there been some kind of new king that has maybe arisen here in your region?" Now, up to this point, Herod had just been picking his fingernails. He hadn't really been listening at all. But now he comes to, rapt attention, real attention. And so he gets a little nervous, and he says, "Will you excuse me for just a moment?" And he goes down to the chapel and he finds some of the clergy, and they go ripping through the concordance, and they say, oh yes, okay, there is a little something here. It's in the book of Micah, something about maybe a Messiah being born in Bethlehem. It's nothing to get excited about. But look, Herod was so paranoid, it didn't take much of anything to get him stirred up. So he comes back and he says, "All right, folks, oh yes, I would like you to go down to this Bethlehem place as soon as you can. And you can go with my blessing, one condition, that you come back and tell me about my successor so I can send flowers." At this point, the Magi were feeling pretty queasy. But as soon as they stepped back out into the clear night air, they could trace the track of the star again, and they followed it all the way to this little one-room house. It was pretty neat. But it was awfully small to house a king. You could smell dinner still in the air, the wheat cakes that had been cooked on the griddle. So here they were. They came into this place that was crowded and cramped, and they were bringing their gifts with them, and they had to stoop over so their turbans wouldn't be knocked off their heads by the low rafters. And when they got inside, all they could see was the baby, who was not afraid, whose right eye shone with the same star that had them on the road all this time. It was he then, whoever he was. They didn't have a clue, but they knew what they needed to do, and that's what they did. They got down on their knees and they worshiped him. Oh, that's when they gave him the things they brought him, but now they realized they were the wrong things. He couldn't do much with this at all. What they should have done, bring some things that the child could use, like maybe a warm blanket, some goat's milk, or something shiny to put above the crib. But who would expect a king to come something like this? Don't you just love the irony of all this? Here were the chosen people, translated the church, poring over the scriptures, debating fine points of theology, doing it so neat and orderly that they missed the whole thing. And along come these travelers, wrong occupation, wrong race, wrong denomination, and they start teaching them where to look and teaching them to stop talking and to start committing. Don't you just love the irony of that? But here's the part of their story that's most compelling to me. It's the way it ends. After they've worshiped, they get up and they stretch and they kiss the baby goodbye. And then this is what the text says. They went home the same old path? No. They went home by another way. That's the way it happens, doesn't it? You have an epiphany. Some light comes into your room that hasn't quite been there before, and everything changes. It's like you get moved. You get transferred your citizenship to a new land. Oh, you may go back to the same old places and doing the same old things, but everything's different. And that's the way it was for these travelers. They're going to roll up their old maps because their old maps aren't going to work anymore. They're going to have to find a new way to go home. I would hope after the journey we've been on at Christmas, that's kind of where we are. We just can't go back to the old ways. We're going to be finding some new ways. I don't know what the wise men truly gathered. I don't know all that they understood on that day, but I think they knew this much. That they could never think about the presence of God in the world in the same old way. And can we, after we've made another visit to the manger, don't we find ourselves getting popped out of those old ruts of thinking about God as just a distant deity, a vague abstraction floating above human time and space? No, once you see God in a stable, in a manger, you don't know what ludicrous depths God will go to get tied up in our world. Think about it. The Nativity story is all about God being at home in all the ordinary details of our life. Having a child, paying your taxes. Sounds like a pretty familiar universal plot of our story, right? How about God being at home in a humble address? I don't care how much we idealize or dress up the Nativity story. It still represents crude accommodations in a little side street stable. Okay. I think you've heard me talk before about my one trip to the Holy Land. I was disappointed at first because I was told Bethlehem was going to be closed off. There were so many protests, but we had a guide that got us in the back door. We climbed this embankment and walked into Bethlehem. And of course we went to that traditional site where they say that the child was born and built, of course, a beautiful sanctuary there. Some of you have been there. Well, you go in. I know what struck me that day. I thought if you did not know the biblical story, if you went there, you would have had no thought that the child had been born in something like a stable. I mean, it was a beautiful place. There were innumerable votive lights, and the whole place was gold, gilded with gold and silver. And you say, of course it was. These are people glorifying and praising the birth of the Son. But it struck me just maybe a little differently. It made me think maybe the church was faced with a little bit of biographical embarrassment. What do you mean by that, Rob? It's called the scandal of the incarnation. I mean, where's the majesty? Where's the dignity in that? God getting tied up, really tied up in flesh and blood and dirt and sky and earth. But you see, we have to go that way now. Of this worldly God, once you've been to the manger. A God who meets us in the baby's low cry as well as the vastness of the universe. A God who is as much at home in the acrid smells of the manger as in the incense atmosphere of the sanctuary. So what does all that mean? It means we're going to go another way. We're not going to walk around as though God is aloof and apart. We're going to be ready to be surprised any time, any place. Don't lace up your tennis shoes too tight, says this story. Don't think you got to keep running after some place out there that is holy. Just be aware that wherever you're standing, be ready to take off your shoes, because it just may be holy ground. But there's another way that I see being played out here. I don't know if the wise men were aware of this. They must have felt something about the humility of God. And this is not a God who's going to be lording it over us. And we know how that story got played out in the life of Jesus. No, this is one who's not going to be lording it over us. This is going to be one who is coming, self-giving, serving. Paul picked up on that. He said the child of Bethlehem becomes the God-man Jesus. And Paul went on and said, seeing that equality with God was not something to be grasped, he emptied himself and took the form of a servant all the way to death. Now I want you to see what Matthew is doing. Over against that way, he's going to lift up Herod's way. Let me say a word about Herod. Give Herod a little bit of credit. He was no fool. He knew what it took to get to the top, and he knew how to stay there. And once he saw that he had some opposition, well, he knew how to eliminate them. This is true now. Before he was done, he killed one of his wives, 3 of his sons, and a brother-in-law. Augustus Caesar said, I think, frankly, it's safer to be Herod's pig than one of his sons. But do you catch the way of Herod? It's the way of greed, hunger for power, and then paranoid fear about losing it. Oh my goodness, you get all that tied together and wow, it's toxic. The biblical account said it was so toxic that it led Herod to slaughter the innocents of Bethlehem. Now look, there are some scholars that doubt that there was ever a mass slaughter because they said it was never recorded in any of the other histories. I don't know. Whatever the case in Bethlehem, we know this. Herod was willing to kill children to keep his power. Now hear this, think about it. The Herod way is still alive. That's why we keep this terrible sounding figure in the story. The next war, whoever wages it, is going to be planned by probably older men sitting in their comfortable offices, and it'll be fought on the ground by people the age of their children and grandchildren. And most of the casualties will probably be between the ages of 18 and 22, and in some places younger than that. So the old sad music of the ancient story of Herod is still being played out. But do you see what Matthew is doing here? The one whom Herod sought to kill models another way. His tools will be service and not violence. His goals will not be gaining and maintaining power, but using his power to empower others. And do you get the feeling that right here at the beginning of Matthew's gospel, he's just throwing the dilemma at us. He says, what are you going to do with this child born to be king? Are you going to buy into Herod's old death-dealing ways and reject him? Or with the wisdom of the Magi, will you fall and worship him? I'm sure some of you, like me, found some joy in that PBS series, Upstairs, Downstairs. All right, you got some old upstairs, downstairs fans out there, I bet. Now, Upstairs, it was the Bellamys. Now, this was in the turn of the 20th century. It was set in London, of course, and the Bellamys were the aristocratic family that lived upstairs. Downstairs were the people, quote, in service, the maids, the cooks, the butlers. And so the best I can remember in one of these episodes, Hudson, the head butler for the Bellamys, is there, and a younger butler from next door comes over, and he's impetuous, and he's kind of full of himself, and he says, I'm sick of being in service. I want to do my own thing. And he says, besides, my master is a fool. And Hudson just takes it in pretty slowly and says, I remember him saying something like this: so you serve a master who is a fool. My master is brave and true, and his family is noble and gentle. I'm proud to be in their service. And then in a typical British manner and almost a fatherly tone, he says, young man, you know, everyone has to say sir to someone. Everyone except King George. Truth be told, everyone, even King George, even Herod, says sir to some driving, motivating, compelling authority in their lives. So here's Matthew's question this morning as we move into this new year on Epiphany Sunday. What are you going to do with the child born to be king? He's going to be king like nobody else kinged it on this earth. Will you say yes to him? Will you serve? Will you join with the Magi and put your feet on that path that will be going home a new way, another way?